than 5 minutes. So we want to take your temperature on the changes that California are embarking on, and we're going to do this a couple times during the day. So, as Linda mentioned, there have been dramatic changes in the state in the past few years. We have new academic standards, a more equitable, though frankly not adequate funding system. Through the local control funding formula, we have a new locally driven decision-making process with the local control and accountability plans. And now we have a new school and district improvement system with report cards that are soon to come. So before we start with our first panel, we want you to rate where you think we are now with the changes. How optimistic are you, or do you feel the reforms currently underway in California will result in real changes in the state and or improve student performance? So it's on a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is the Olympus of education reform, and you can say, world, we've got it. The changes are coming and they're in line, and we're on a direction to improve education for every student and every school. And number 1 is sort of like, I don't know, maybe you feel like a Soviet pensioner, you know. Maybe No Child Left Behind wasn't so bad, you're kind of nostalgic for it, and you're saying, you know, give me that API again, just give me a 3-digit number and cut all this talk. So what I'd like you to do is take a piece of paper, we have them at the tables, and just write down a number from 1 to 10. And, you know, don't even think, just out of, you know, one of our presidential candidates, the best judgments are made from the gut. So just give me a number from 1 to 10. Take a second, write it down. Okay, now turn to the person you met during the break and take 45 seconds, honestly, no more than 45 seconds, to explain to that person why you chose the number that you chose. Okay, I'm timing it. Okay, thanks. So, give that person 45 seconds to explain to you why he or she chose that number. Just 45 seconds. Okay, thanks. So, the last part of this exercise. The last part of this exercise is take your paper. We're going to need someone at your table who can do math in his or her head, or pull out a phone and use your calculator. We want the table average. So give all the numbers to one person, have the person add it up, divide by the number of people. Really quickly if we can. We want a table average.
Isn't it 1,000? Yeah. percentage increase. Yeah.
So raise your hand when you have that average. Somebody, raise your hand when you have that average. Fantastic. So the last part of the exercise is we want somebody to stand up and shout out that number from each table. It doesn't have to be every table. So don't use your classroom voice. Use your Steph Curry hit the three-pointer, the won the game in Oracle, and more you want to shout out. So somebody stand up and shout out a number, please. 8. Oh, one at a time. Sorry. 7. 5.8. 6. 8. Oh, 3.75. Skeptics. Okay, any more? 7. Okay. Thank you. So, at the end of the day, I think we'll check back and see if how our 6 hours of discussion have affected your perspective. So let's go to the first panel. Let me quickly introduce our panelists. Ramona Bishop is Superintendent of the Vallejo City Unified School District and President of the California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators. In his second tour of duty, Michael Kirst has been President of the State Board of Education since 2011 and is Professor Emeritus of Education at Stanford. He was also President of the board during Jerry Brown's first terms as governor, and I must say those films are starting to look grainy, Mike. Dianna MacDonald is the president-elect of the California PTA, having served the PTA in various capacities at the local, regional, and state levels. David Plank has been executive director of the Policy Analysis for California Education, or PACE, since 2007. After having created the Education Policy Center as a professor at Michigan State University. Samantha Tran is Senior Managing Director of Education Policy at Children Now, where she oversees education policy and the advocacy agenda. So I've asked David to start us off by giving us about 10-minute summary from his perspective of the new system that the State Board of Education approved and where we're headed. David?
Well, thanks, John. And all of you who've done these kinds of events before know that when you get up on the podium, you're really just providing footnotes to Linda Darling-Hammond's presentation. So it's always tough to come after Linda, but I'll do my best to at least provide some additional detail behind what she had to say. I guess the first thing that I want to say is I want to emphasize how radical the changes are that California is making. Linda showed her compliance model versus her empowerment model, and those are radically different models of what accountability looks like and how an education system operates. We're trying to move from compliance, empowerment is one way of characterizing it. I would say we're trying to move from a system of compliance to continuous improvement. And that's a very difficult shift. It's a radical shift. We're partway down the road, but we have a lot of work to do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the big issues that we face as we try to make that change. The local control funding formula put in place what I consider the necessary conditions for this transformation. It rationalized our finance system, and Governor Brown's principle of subsidiarity established a new set of governance arrangements that make it possible for local actors at the district and school level to engage in a process of continuous improvement. We're now working on developing a state accountability framework that will support rather than stifle those local efforts and move us towards a culture of continuous improvement at the local level. I want to say one thing before I get into the four issues that I want to talk about, and that is really to thank my fellow panelist Mike Kirst and the State Board of Education for their recognition that this remains very much a work in progress, that we're not going to get it right on the first attempt, and that it's going to take time for us to both develop and refine this new accountability system. And we have to both take that time and use that time well if we're going to arrive at a system that actually supports opportunity and success for all California students. I want to talk about 4 key issues that face our state as we begin to build this new accountability system. And the first is the development of a system that focuses not on a single score, not on whether you made 800 or not, but on the use of multiple measures to evaluate schools. And I'll make my own position clear on this. Those of you who know me know what my position is, which is that what we're trying to do is to finally drive a stake through the heart of the API. That this vampire continually rises from the grave, and we're finally engaged in the final struggle, the end of the vampire kingdom, to simply kill it off once and for all. But the work's not done. And we really have still quite a lot to do to ensure that we take multiple measures seriously, that we don't sort of put multiple measures on a screen and then say, but what really matters is the way we sum those up and put them together into a single indicator. So why are multiple measures important? Why are multiple measures better than a single score? Multiple measures provide schools, provide parents, provide local communities with information about the strengths and weaknesses of schools. And Linda mentioned a report that PACE has done recently that shows that there are only a handful of schools. About 1% of schools in California are bad at everything. Okay. 1% of schools in California, and you'll identify those schools with an index, an API, any measure that you choose. 1% of schools are bad at everything. 99% of schools are good at some things and bad at other things. And unless you evaluate their performance on multiple measures, you have no way of knowing what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, what they need to improve, and what assets they have to build on. So that as a system that is organized around the idea of continuous improvement requires that kind of detailed information about the strengths and weaknesses of individual schools in order to drive the process of improvement, in order to give parents, communities, teachers the information they need to get better. Single measures conceal all of that. Single measures, if you give a school an A or an F, all of that information is lost. All that you can say is that the school is good or bad. And this PACE report that came out recently shows that those judgments in all but the 1% of schools are necessarily arbitrary and misleading. Okay, because they're concealing information about what schools are good at and what schools are bad at. So some schools that are doing very well on some indicators will come out as bad on an index. Some schools that are doing badly on some indicators will come out as doing fine on an index. So you're simply misleading schools and punishing schools needlessly, stigmatizing schools needlessly if you score them on a single index. The second issue, and I think this is really where the effort to make continuous improvement real in California schools is taking place, is around the Local Control Accountability Plan. Local Control Accountability Plan was an instrument required by the legislature that asked districts to look at 8 different sets of indicators to evaluate the performance of their schools, and required them to engage with parents and the local community to develop a plan to improve over time. And the reason why this has turned out to be difficult, I think, is that districts, after 20 years of PSAA, NCLB style accountability, naturally enough looked at the local control accountability plan as a compliance exercise rather than as an exercise devoted to supporting continuous improvement in their schools. So there are a couple of consequences to that. One is that, once again, some research that PACE has been involved in has shown that, to our great surprise, even school boards have not been deeply involved in the LCAP process. Communities, we did some polling recently on the LCAP process and found that fewer than 10% of Californians even know that there is such a thing as the LCAP process, and a much smaller percentage than 10% have either been invited to or have participated in a meeting that would help to develop their local control accountability plan. And we find that both for local reasons but also for state policy reasons, local control accountability plans tend to be weakly, if at all, linked to school budgets and strategic plans and other aspects of school governance that really ought to be integral parts of a single planning process. But for now, the LCAP sort of stands alone as something that districts are trying to figure out how to do as a compliance exercise rather than as an integral part of the ways in which they support local continuous improvement. A third issue is, as Linda said, we're moving from a system that relied on sanctions and shaming and punishment to drive improvement in schools to one that focuses on technical assistance and support to school districts. That's a big challenge for California. We have begun to think about an infrastructure that would support that process. We have created the California Collaborative for Education Excellence, the CCEE. We have empowered county offices of education to take a lead role in both evaluating the performance of their local school districts and in providing technical assistance and support to districts and schools that need it. I think, or I hope, that we are in the process of mobilizing all of the technical assistance providers in the state to work together on this challenge. Because we have, in California, quite a long history of failure in trying to do this. I mean, many of you will remember SATE's dates, high priority schools. We've been down this road before with the idea that the state should send someone out to local school districts and provide guidance and advice and well, really guidance and advice. I guess that's about as far as we went with that process in most cases. And then the district would somehow magically get better. Well, never happened, right? Many of you may probably know this joke, but it's one of my favorite jokes, so I'll tell it anyway, which is it's light bulb humor from the 1990s. You know, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is 1. But the light bulb really has to want to change. Okay? Well, the same thing is true of schools, and you know we can send all the psychiatrists we want out to local school districts and tell them what they ought to be doing and hand them a guidebook or a rule book and say, you know, here's the plan, here's what you need to do. But in fact, what we're trying to do is to create a culture of continuous improvement at all levels of the system, including the local level, including the school level. And that requires buy-in from local actors that was not ever forthcoming in our previous efforts to support this kind of continuous improvement from the state. So that brings me to the final point that I'm going to make in my brief comments today, and that is that the real shift that's going on in California is ultimately not a policy shift. We're well down the road towards making that policy shift, and the state board, the legislature, many of the people on this panel, many of the people in this room are working assiduously to drive that policy shift forward and to get the policy details right. But what's really at stake here is a culture shift. That for the last 20 years or so, we have relied on, as I said earlier, PSAA, NCLB style accountability that basically tells schools whether they're good or bad, and then, with the old Nike slogan says, just do it, just get better. And that hasn't worked. We've made the U-turn, we've made the radical shift towards a different accountability model, but we're working, all of us, we are a generation, and we are working with a generation of educators who have spent the last 20 years trying to figure out what the federal government wants, what the state government wants, what the rules are, how we're supposed to behave, what we're supposed to do to make sure that we stay within the lines and that we do what the state requires, that we get our score up over 800, what have you. The success of the new accountability system requires a very different orientation. It requires first of all, the acceptance of responsibility at the local level, the acknowledgement at the local level that local educators, school boards, and communities have a lot more authority than they had previously, and with that authority goes responsibility, but the state isn't going to fix this for us. The state is not going to do that. The initiative to make it happen has to come from local actors. And I think and that culture shift is not something that's going to happen overnight. I mean, it's clearly something that has not really happened yet, as the LCAP experience illustrates. We're still trying to figure out what the state wants. What are the rules? What are we supposed to put in this damn LCAP that will prevent the state from bothering us after we submit it? And that's the wrong question to ask. The right question is, how can we use an LCAP to drive improvement in our school and in our district? So I want to just close by saying that what we're faced now is a very different challenge than the challenges we faced in the recent past. It's really not a question of getting the rules right or of telling schools or school districts that are falling short what they need to do. The new accountability system really aims to get everyone, the state, local education leaders, teachers unions, school boards, parents, communities, working together to improve opportunities and outcomes for all California students. And I think that is the right work to be engaged in. I'm delighted that so many of you are here to talk about how we can get this right in the next couple of years, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. That terrific framework, not only where we are, but where we need to be. So let's talk with our panelists. Mike, quickly, what's your response to what you heard from David? And do you have any other points? And long-term impact, if a system works, what will it accomplish?
Right. Well, I agree with his comments, and I just want to paint sort of the broad context we're in to start with in accountability, like our other policies. The watchwords of the state leadership have been patience, persistence, and humility. And so our patience will be, we have 8 years of stable leadership that has been working on this. We understand it takes time, but we're going to persist over that period of time. We have a stable political coalition that supports these reforms in the legislature and in the governor's office. And we've had a favorable rising tide of revenue that Mac Taylor outlined. So we're going to be persistent, but we're going to proceed with humility. That's what you get when you get septuagenarians. They get humble because they realize that you don't know as much as I knew at 35, and now we're much more ready to say we can't exactly predict what's going to happen with all this, but we're going to make changes, we're going to listen, and we want to, however, not zigzag our policy lines, so we'll make these changes in a manner that doesn't, I think, jerk the local districts around from one thing to another. So I think that's important. The other is that there's very much a belief in a law that a colleague of mine at Harvard, Richard Elmore, gave called Elmer's Law, which most states have gotten wrong in the past. As you increase accountability, imagine a scale, you need to increase the capacity of local school districts to meet those accountability standards in an equal manner. The policies of the past have been largely you ratchet up accountability and you don't do much with local capacity. So we are looking very carefully at the next big thing in California policy, which will be capacity building through the new elementary and secondary, the ESSA Act at the federal level. So given this kind of a philosophy, what it would look like, I think, would be we would have a more complete picture and understanding of exactly what is taking place at local school districts and schools. It'll be much more robust and informative. We will increase capacity and assistance to local school districts to deal with the accountability issues that are raised. And it'll create, hopefully, a synergy between whatever we're trying to transmit to you on accountability at the school level, synergy between the top and the bottom of the system, and trying to get that balance right. So we're still, we did the best we could, I think, on these rounds, this latest round of accountability. We have a lot more to do, however. Career readiness is still a work in progress, for example. The transparency of spending in the LCAP is a work in progress and hindered by the obscure nature of the local accounting codes, which are just big budgets, big categories like instruction and student services and administration. So there's plenty to do, but I think we're hopefully I think we are on the right road, and hopefully we'll be able to make continuous improvement changes to make it even better.
Thanks, Mike. So Ramona, from a superintendent perspective on a district level, is what David said about the shift in culture that has to take place at a district level, did that ring true to you, and how do you foresee using the lots of data that you're going to get from these report cards to influence perhaps your LCAP, or the actions that you take?
Okay, so in order to answer that, I think I want to go to point 3 that David made around technical assistance and capacity, and then go back to the LCAP. Because as a superintendent of Vallejo, I've been there for the last 5 years. I took over a district that was in state receivership when I got there, and we've taken it out of that. But really, to say that the state is going to come in and provide technical assistance in any way kind of rings very strange for me. I took over a school district that was 54% graduation rate. The state had been there for quite some time. And so I'm just wondering kind of what that looks like as it relates to all of this. And I appreciate the humility of the state board. I think we are all humble in these times of really exploring together what it looks like to support one another. So not only was our school district 54% graduation rate, it's now 74 in the last 5 years. We were, when you look at the Office of Civil Rights data, we were in the top 10 suspending districts. So it was basically what Linda described, that pipeline to prison, and, you know, the spending, instead of going into education, was going into our local jail facilities. So I think, you know, in order to get this right, really what I did in 2011 is just hit the ground running with being humble. You know, really putting the data in front of everyone and saying, how are we going to work on this together? Because to really think that a school system can solve all the problems of the city is really what we've done in the past. We've held educators accountable for the conditions of unemployment, housing, all those issues that have impact our students' ability to live and to be able to show what they know on any kind of measure. And so really what we've done is really an LCAP process even before the LCAP existed. And I'm really thankful to the state legislature as advised by the governor for really investing in school systems like mine. We're talking about $22 million in supplemental and education funding. And so there is not a parent in our district that doesn't know what that is. We have really done a lot of organizing around what is it that we should do with this gift that has been provided by the state. And we recognize that if districts like ours are not successful, then it'll be a failed experiment of some sort. And so truly as educators, what I believe we should be doing is opening up our classrooms, our schools, and our districts to learn from one another, and really thinking about what collaboration looks like at the end of the day, so that our state can show that this is a successful model, that the finger pointing is over, and that we're all in this together. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks. So Dianna, why is parent engagement important to you personally, and to the PTA, and so the dilemma that the board faces is really how you measure it? And I think when we've talked, you said it's not just involvement in the LCAP level, but it's also involvement in understanding of what their students experience. So talk a little bit about that, if you will.
Sure. Well, the California State PTA family engagement has always been one of our #1 priorities. There's decades of research that show that when parents and families are engaged in their children's education, that their students do better, the communities do better. So it's a critical component. We also know that when schools involve their parents and families, that the children that are on the achievement gap, the ones that have the opportunity gap, that is more likely to be closed. So it's so critical for all of our children in our schools to make sure that their families are engaged in an authentic way. And truly, schools have to be vulnerable right now. They have to be willing to show the data of the children and where they're really kind of failing, so that they reach out to all their stakeholders, which include parents, to help close those gaps and ask them for solutions. And I can use the example of chronic absenteeism. If parents don't understand that if their child misses 2 days a month, that they're chronically absent, then they're never going to get them there. They have to be told. I didn't know that when I went into school. Sometimes my kids just didn't want to go to school, but for me personally, once I knew what it was going to do to their education, it made more sense to make sure that I was up early and ready so that I could get my kids to school on time. Personally, being involved not only changed my children's lives, but it also changed my own life. The more knowledgeable that I became about the school and the system, the more willing I was to be able to run for election to be on my local school board, the more willing I was to be able to hold conversations with other parents so that they too could be engaged and involved. And when it comes to measurements or the LCFF rubric, there's two different things that are happening right now. We have the local decision making, and then we also have what the state is measuring us by. But PTA feels strongly that we should have some measurements in place so that it's not just a checkoff list of how many parents are in your seats at your meetings. We really want to see emerging, progressing, and excelling in family engagement. And we want to do that through qualitative and quantitative data. We know that you can say, well, we had 50 parents at back to school night this year, but next year we want to have 100 parents at back to school night. And when that's focused on, we know the things that are measured are really the things that get achieved in school districts. So we'd like to see some more work in that arena from the State Board of Education. And I'm going to tout for a second, PTA has the national standards for family and schools partnerships, and these have rubrics built into them. They're on our website, so please go to that. They're in 6 different languages so that you can use that as part of your LCAP process. And as far as the LCAP process and having it be a priority for parents' engagement, we know that by law you have to have families engaged in the process, but that is not what we're talking about when it comes to authentic engagement. If you have a new state standard, and I don't know if as educators, has anyone had any complaints around math? Just wondering, because if parents don't understand why we have new standards, why they have to learn things in a different way, why they need to be critical thinkers, why the students are being challenged, then how are they going to support you when they go home? So from my perspective, if you don't have them involved in that process, we have college and career indicators that the state is measuring us by, but if parents don't know how to do FAFSAs, if they don't know how to do financial aid paperwork, if they don't know what an A through G requirement is, then how in the world are we going to make sure that they're college or career ready? And finally, do you want me to talk about the dashboard yet? Did you ask me that question?
Let's come back to that.
All right, we'll come back.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Samantha, have we created a unified federal state system as the state board says that we have? And I guess tied with that, the children now sponsored a bill that the legislature overwhelmingly passed, and the governor vetoed, which had a little different perspective on how to measure school improvement and progress, and I think maybe you and David disagree on a little bit of that. Talk about how you see it differently.
So building on the theme of policy is a blunt instrument, and we all get that and need to be thoughtful and careful about how we think about this, this framework that we're trying to create. I think a core premise or belief that we have is that the state has an important role to play. And so how do we think about state policy, since we can't mandate this culture shift that so many of us want to see and support in California? And so I think there's this delicate balance there. And LCFF got us on the right track in that it recognized we need to invest. We need to invest in equity in a substantial way. We need to allow educators and local communities to think about the needs of their unique student populations and how they craft programs and services to support them. I actually used to work, before being at Children Now, I was at the California School Boards Association and worked with governance teams across the state. And one of the challenges always was, like, we're getting all these gift cards from the state. We don't know how to make something coherent locally in terms of serving our kids. So we're moving in the right direction on that front. But the state also has this fundamental role in ensuring that we ultimately get to this North Star of kids succeeding and excelling. And as Linda mentioned earlier, you know, our outcomes are challenged in California, so how do we get there from here? And the board's work so far has moved in some important directions that I think many of us are supportive of, that we're moving to multiple measures, we're having a more holistic understanding of the things that educators and communities can move early in the process, like chronic absenteeism, reducing suspension rates, engaging parents, because we know that those things have an impact on the outcomes. But there are some core things that we still need to wrestle through, and we have the kind of policy timeline that will require us to wrestle through it, and that's essentially figuring out what are we going to do with the federal resources and this new ESSA, the new federal requirements. And I don't think this is about, at least from our perspective, of complying with the federal government. I think there are some fundamental policy issues that are important that we need to figure out how we bake into the system in a little bit better way. So what the board has already adopted has moved us to multiple measures, of which we're really supportive. And for those state indicators, the ability to dig all the way down to the school level and subgroup level. And that's really important because otherwise we're going to lose sight of how kids are doing and subgroups are doing of students. And so we need to keep that in the works. I think the core question, though, is how do we take those multiple measures and then from a state kind of fundamental responsibility, prioritize if there's some challenges that are happening, right? And I used to do FICMAT audits, and so, you know, going into districts that were really struggling financially, and you would find that in addition to the financial struggles, there were often other challenges too. And so a lot of it is about building skill, and then some of it is external pressure can be helpful. And so how do we balance these things? And I know we'll talk a little bit more about how we bring these multiple measures together in order to make those decisions. And so I just think there's again, a lot of key work that we need to do in the next couple months.
Gets us to the issue of the dashboard, and which is, Linda showed that slide, and you probably didn't get a really good look of that's a potential way that all this data will be displayed. And one of the questions is, do you list all the priorities, or do you come up with some kind of summary of a school or district's performance? And it gets to the issue of it, you know, school improvement. There's school improvement, which is useful, particularly for data to make changes in your LCAP. And then there's accountability, which is I'm a parent and I want to know whether I should send my child to this school or another school. So they're not at cross purposes, but how you display it is very important. So I think you have some, maybe I think you and Ramona may have a little disagreement on that. Talk a little bit about how this should be, what parents expect when they get this report card.
So first off, PTA is really in favor of the multiple measures. We do feel that one number is not an indication of how well schools are doing. We know that they could be doing great in school safety and in equity, but maybe their scores don't reflect it. So we are appreciative of having the multiple measures so that schools really get a fair shake. When they were just based on one number, we just felt that it was really negative and it wasn't being used properly and all the data wasn't being displayed. There's been some feedback that we've received. There's two different kinds of the displays that seem to make more sense to parents. One of them is like the Trivial Pursuit or the pie wedges that Linda showed earlier today, and then the other was kind of the little donut-shaped one with the size dots. But some of the feedback is, well, what if you're printing that information out and it's not in color? How easy will that be for parents to actually understand? And the other is how they're going to be doing the equity report and how that's going to be displayed. From my perspective, I have to tell you, the first time I looked at those display charts, I was like, what in the heck is this? It made no sense to me. And so I called somebody up and I said, I don't understand this. So then she walked me through it. And so when I went back, I thought, okay, if I'm really trying to understand what these displays say, how is a parent going to look at this? And then it made me think, what will the school's role be in explaining how the dashboards are read by parents? And to me, that's the piece that we have to really focus on. No matter what display we use, schools have to do their part to ensure that parents understand even how to read those reports.
So, Ramona, I think you have expressed some confidence that your parents will be able to understand.
I really, again, our parents along the way have been completely connected to the process. They're completely connected to the goals. They know the goals probably better than I do. And they are completely aligned to what we saw in the pie charts and so forth this morning. And so I think more of my concern is the fact that what happens in districts like mine, and in fact districts like Oakland where I used to be a teacher, is we get compared to districts like, in my community, we get compared to Benicia, which is really an unfair comparison. Our unduplicated count is 74.1%, something like that. It changes every day. And theirs is, maybe 20%. And so really, when you look at these things, I know we're talking about kind of moving away from API, but as a leader who always goes to communities that need more of our care, very diverse communities, kids of color, English learners, high poverty, I really want to make sure that we are looking at comparisons that are fair. I like the fact that the accountability system is based on growth. I like the fact that it's looking at longitudinally 3 years of growth. That is important to us. But also, we really want to make sure that, an Oakland is not comparable to a San Francisco. It is unfair. So how do we ensure that we hold ourselves incredibly accountable for these young people? I'm not saying they should have a different expectation than anyone else, but how do we make sure these comparisons are not necessarily made? And the parent that's looking to buy a house in our community, how does that parent know kind of the issues that face the school and how students are compared to other schools that are very much like that community? So that is more my concern than anything.
Thanks. Now, Mike, you talked about growth. Growth is a new concept here. We're not just measuring year-to-year scores, but growth, and will that lead to the identification of perhaps a different set of schools, those schools that have but have been kind of stagnating over the years in terms of identifying them as needing improvement?
Well, I think the Vallejo example was a good one. I think you said your graduation rates went from 54% to 74%. Now, 74% is still very low and below the state average, and you're, not happy that job is done. But, we're certainly going to be, where you're really, I think districts will be in more likelihood of getting assistance from the state will be if you're really low and you're not growing for a number of years. So you look at these two factors in an interwoven way, and I think that will lead you to a different mix of schools that you'll look at. So I think that we are carefully looking at growth, and it's very much in all of our minds, because the state is really moving, and the local districts more and more, to continuous improvement, that wherever you are, you keep improving. You don't get from 54 to 74 in one jump. I mean, it takes some time, and it takes more and more incremental action. So that's the sort of thing we're trying to stimulate, and so you'll be hearing a lot more about concepts of continuous improvement and how that gets into this. So if there is continuous improvement, I think that will be taken into account in this. The system also has local elements to it, and those will be used locally in the LCAP and in local judgments, but we will also look at those at the state level. Let's take the parent engagement comment. Parent engagement is one of the 8 state priorities. So what are we to do with that in the short run? Well, we're not going to promulgate some grand survey of parent engagement, because we don't know what the grand survey would be. So the state will vet various, and for reliability, validity, and what they measure, various parent engagement surveys, and then say, these look good to us. You can use others, but here's some that we vetted. And then produce this data on parent engagement locally. You need to look at it, certainly for your own local uses, but we'll also look at it and take into account what you're generating from the bottom up. School climate will evolve in the same way. We don't have a consensus on a school climate measure. I'm not even sure we have a common definition of it. So there's both statewide standardization and then local bottom-up indicators that are going to be flowing up to us, and we'll look for growth in both.
So we have a couple moments for questions. If folks want to go to the mic, we have. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Doug Ford from the Solano Board of Education. I'm frustrated because the people at the state level are reshuffling the No Child Left Behind cards. We need to throw those cards away and look at the real world. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, Stanley Williams, who's Chief Scientific Officer for Hewlett-Packard several years ago, was interviewed about his work and the problems that he has with his work. He started with about 7 or 8 people working for him.
Doug, I don't want to interrupt, but we need a question. We need a question.
He worked up to 90 people working for him. Not one of those people Hewlett-Packard hired was educated K-12 in the United States. They all came from other countries who are doing a good job of educating their people. Now, I want to mention Ramona Bishop is one of the outstanding educators that is talking to employers. Why is not the people at the state level, why are not they talking to employers so that we can provide education that fits the needs of employers?
Okay, thank you, thank you. You know, David, Doug, David, Mike, where does the needs of employers fit into this schedule?
I actually think that California is doing a reasonably good job of talking to employers. I mean, the Hewlett-Packard example has as much to do with HB1 visas as it has to do with California's education system. You know, through the work of the Linked Learning Alliance, through the California Career Academies and other organizations that are engaged in workforce preparation, I think that California over the last several years has really strengthened its efforts to reach out to employers and to try to figure out how to adapt programs, particularly in secondary schools, to the changing needs of California's labor market.
Yeah, and I speak all over the Bay Area, and when I talk about what is in our new Common Core standards and what is in our new Smarter Balanced Assessment, and this analysis, synthesis, defending your answers, building concepts together in a performance exam, and the standards where you just don't memorize mathematical formulas but apply them, I could go on and on, they really like what we're doing. And so I get just a lot of feedback that you're finally on the right track, and we've just begun on this effort. So I get a lot of reinforcement from employers on our direction.
Mike, let me tell you one last quick question, and that is we're working on a career and college indicator, but that's not an easy thing to do, particularly to measure career readiness. And Samantha, I know you've got some thoughts too, Mike. Whoever.
Yeah, it's a work in progress in this regard. We don't, you know, we've come up with this idea, and employers have endorsed it, of we need more pathways from high school to careers, and so we're working out course sequences that align from high school into post-secondary education, community college, or workforce on-the-job training. We're trying to measure, you know, whether districts are creating these pathways and how many students are proceeding through them. But we're at the beginning stages of really identifying what those pathways are, and at this point, we're still developing them. There's also some talk of developing of some kinds of assessments that might get closer to workforce skills. But it is an area we really would like to measure much better, and we've scoured the country, talked to the experts, and we've put in our career and college index what we think is worthwhile including, but we're working on much more to include.
Quick thoughts on that, Sam?
Yeah, well, it's a work in progress. We're really pleased that the board included it. I mean, if you look at the data, there's not a one-to-one match between a kid who graduates and whether or not they're actually going to be ready for college and career. So having that signal in the system is really important. There's, as Mike said, there's a lot of work that needs to happen to shore this indicator up. Early on, the proposal had 4 levels, with the highest level being this concept that aligns with what David mentioned earlier of this work towards linked learning and pathways, where you actually do rigorous coursework and embed it with engaging career technical education that actually sets a kid off on the path to a high-paying career. And we're not there yet on the career pathways. We have some really strong models out there. The state level data is not nuanced enough on this front to be able to answer that core question. If a kid is doing CTE coursework, is it going to prepare them for a high-paying profession? And how do we get at that data issue and that quality issue? And I think that's a big policy conversation for us to have with the legislature, with the board, moving forward, so that we can really make this robust and meaningful.
Great. We're not going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to have a stretch break in here, and then we're going to head to lunch. So do we have time for one more question quickly?
Yeah, Bonnie Hansen, Sequoia Union High School District, Assistant Superintendent. And I'm looking, first of all, kudos on the CTE measure. That's really exciting, especially the money to go along with it through the CTIG grants. My question is the Collaborative for Educational Excellence that will work with underperforming schools. I'm sure that the publishers are already circling the state capitol, and I'm wondering what the stance at this point at least is going to be on requiring schools to adopt approved textbooks versus creating a rubric for schools to improve with state help the curriculum that their teachers are already using.
Anyone? I think we're the question of approved textbooks, right, in relation to, I'm not sure how it's related to the collaborative, but you want to know about.
So on the
I can
API
answer
and the AYP, if you weren't making adequate yearly progress, at a certain point you became program improvement, and at a certain point you had to use textbooks off a state-adopted list.
Yeah.
Most of that list was big-name publishers who came up
Okay.
with books.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that's
Go
not
ahead,
going to
Mike.
happen
That
again.
is, that issue was settled by the legislature at the behest of the governor and the board, whereby the state board now does not require any textbooks. We're essentially, when we, quote, adopt a textbook, we say that this is on our list. You can choose from this list or your own materials. So the state is really trying to screen books under state criteria, but the legislature the law says that you can use the instructional materials that you want. So we're not going to be imposing specific instructional materials, but we will help you in guiding what we think is our materials that are aligned to our curriculum and our standards.
Okay, thank you. Thank our panelists. Enjoy.